Hey there, friend. I don't know about you, but it seems like we've got a full moon and it's causing all sorts of biting problems with all of my little kiddo friends. So today I thought I would talk a little bit about biting, why it happens, and what we can do to try to diminish the behavior. So let's get to it. All right, so let's talk biting. This is probably one of the most frustrating behaviors that parents will experience with young children. And in my experience, it usually comes as a result of three different things: fear, frustration, or the need for sensory input. So before discussing the fear and frustration response, I just want to do a quick refresher on brain development using language from Dan Siegel's book, The Whole Brain Child, which is a must read for all parents of young children. So there is an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain, and I am greatly simplifying a very complex system. The upstairs brain has to do with higher level reasoning, problem solving, and things like that. The downstairs brain is also considered the primitive brain, and it really has to do with big emotions and our fight or flight response. So I often tell parents that toddlers are kind of living in that downstairs brain, and preschoolers are down there too sometimes. They've built a rickety stairway up to the right side of the upstairs brain, which is still an emotional center. It's the left side is our logical side of the brain, and kids really don't get to living over there until around the age of 5 or 6. Now, preschoolers will open the door and check out the left side of the brain, but they're still on the right side of the brain, and oftentimes tumble down the steps down into the emotional part of the brain, the downstairs brain. So that's why, if you're like me, when my son was like 4.5 and he was still having meltdowns, and I'm thinking, what's wrong with this kid? What have I done? Do I need to take him to a psychiatrist? It was because he had tumbled down as a result of some limits or not getting his way down into the downstairs brain, leading to meltdowns. So I think it's really important for us to understand what's going on with young children's brain development, because it makes it easier for us to understand their behavior and also be able to meet them where they're at. So why this is important as we're talking about biting is because usually biting, if it's related to a fear or frustration kind of emotion from our young children, is an indicator that they're in that downstairs brain. They are in fight or flight. They feel first and then they act. They oftentimes have not yet developed the cognitive functions to inhibit this kind of behavior, or at least as they're getting older to be able to access it in the moment, because they're just flooded with too much feeling and emotion. So when do we most often see biting in young children? I'm going to say daycare and during interactions with peers. I will talk about the random biting that we see from kids in a moment when I'm talking about the sensory part of biting. So let's talk about the fear or the frustration response. So the fear response could be, oftentimes in my experience, that maybe a peer is getting too close to a little one's kind of bubble, right? All of us have different comfort zones as far as our personal bubble. And there are some kids who have a very big bubble, and there are some kids who have a very small bubble. They're okay with people getting really close to them. Other kids, not so much. My experience has been that for some of those kids that have a big bubble, when other kids enter that bubble, they immediately feel anxious and scared, and that's usually when the bite happens. Now, obviously, biting can happen out of frustration as well, like somebody's trying to take my toy, somebody won't give me something when I want it. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're still all coming from those big feels from that emotional part of the brain. So the biting that we see from a sensory input or a sensory seeking standpoint are usually those random bites. Like you're hanging on to your little one, you're giggling and you're playing, they're having a really great time, and all of a sudden they latch on to your shoulder and leave bite marks. That is usually them just being excited and wanting some sensory input in that moment. So some indicators that a little one is seeking oral sensory input would be that they're doing a lot of chewing on their toys and mouthing a lot of things. Maybe they're chewing on their shirts or their sleeves, or you're getting a lot of biting like that in moments of excitement. because when they bite, they get to tighten all these muscles in their jaw. Oh, and it feels really, really good to them in that moment. So they're not usually doing those bites as a result of a maliciousness or an intent to hurt somebody. It's just something their brain is like, hey, I need some input, and you just happen to be the closest thing to their mouth. Now, before I go on to talk about some strategies, I'm hoping that you'll now look at the biting that your child may be doing through the lens of, are they doing it because they're sensory seeking? Those are those random bites. Are they doing it because other kids are getting in their space? Are they doing it because they're frustrated, they want things and kids aren't giving it to them? Those are just some examples. So looking at it, is it fear? Is it frustration? Or is it sensory seeking? Now, there are some other things that can impact biting that we also need to take into consideration. The first one being that, especially if we're talking toddlers, a lot of times they don't have a whole lot of words that they're able to use in those moments, and they certainly can't access them when they're having big feelings. So the inability to use words to communicate what it is that they're wanting or needing in that moment makes it a challenge for them. There's also many times where there may be sensory overload going on. A lot of times biting seems to happen in places like mall play areas where there's lots of kids and lots of input and lots of noise, or in very busy daycare centers. Biting can also be impacted by anxiousness of a little one who's maybe in a new environment with unfamiliar people and they're feeling unsafe because they don't know what to expect. Another reason could be that maybe there are lots of transitions going on at home, like the birth of a new baby or maybe a move to a new home. Sometimes when there are a lot of transitions and changes going on in a young child's life, they're trying to cope with that as best they can, and it just leaves them with a little bit of fuel in their engine, so they don't have the tolerance or the patience to tolerate different scenarios outside the home. They have a short fuse, I guess is the best way to put it. Some other complicating factors can be teething. That a lot of times I think is more related to those random bites. And then finally, sleep disturbances. If your child is really struggling with getting the appropriate amount of sleep, it is going to impact their behavior, their attention, their concentration during the day. Okay, so let's talk strategies, because that's why you're here. And I'm going to tell you there's no simple and quick fix for biting. And I know particularly for parents, when these things are happening at daycare and daycares are saying, your child bit again, your child bit again, that's a really hard one for you to fix at home, because 9 times out of 10, the biting isn't happening at home, it's happening at the daycare. So the problem really needs to be addressed by the daycare staff. And the one thing that we need to do when those situations are happening at a daycare environment or outside of the home is to, 1, make sure that they're recognizing what is the cause, sensory seeking, fear, frustration. 2, they need to be vigilant. And when I say vigilant, I mean if you have a little one who's going through a biting stage, you need to be very, very close to them during interactions with peers. Now, I'm not saying you want to hover, right? But you want to make sure that as they move over to the play area with the cars, which happen to be their favorite, and the one child that they continue to bite all the time is over there too, that you're going to join that play as well. That allows you then to watch the interaction and look for the cues that the child who may be doing the biting may be demonstrating to indicate the fear or the frustration. Because 93% of communication is body language and tone of voice, only 7% is the words. If we really tune in to our children's body language, oftentimes it allows us the time to then hop in and to do the next strategy, which is to coach in that moment. A lot of times, as I mentioned, they're having big emotions, they're feeling that fear, they're feeling that frustration. If we can hop in and help coach and be kind of the consultant for them in that moment and model the things that they can then do with practice and our support, they then find that there's a different way that they can address this fear or this frustration that they're feeling. So, for example, several weeks ago, I had a little guy at daycare doing a lot of biting there, went in to observe, and he happens to have a very big bubble. Well, he's sitting at the table playing, and he's fine doing his playing until a friend comes into his bubble. He immediately started to gather his toys, even though this friend had zero interest in taking his toys. He was leaning across the table to talk to another child, but he was in this little guy's space, and it happened to be an older and bigger child, which sometimes happens to be the case too, that they target specific kids because of a negative interaction. Anyhow, so as he pulled that in, that was the cue then for us to hop in and coach and say, ooh, is he too close? We can tell him, too close, modeling a gesture and some simple words for him to use, and then coaching with the other child to be aware, look, he's saying that you're too close to him. You need to move out of his space. He doesn't like having you there. And continuing to be there and do these kinds of coaching sessions with both kids, because there's usually a responsibility from each of them in that situation, and they can both learn from that. The biter can learn, I can communicate with this person that they're in my space. The little one who's in his space can realize not everybody likes me to be so close, and I need to be aware that people have personal bubbles. Okay, so that's just an example of how fear of this child being in my space was the cause of the biting that was going on for this little one. Another scenario, obviously, is when a little one is taking a toy out of somebody's hand. The person who has it oftentimes is going to bite. Again, vigilance and coaching, being down there and being present and being able to say, oh, you can tell her, no, thank you. This is mine. And then modeling for the child who wants the toy, you can ask me, turn. And then if the child with the toy says no, oh, well, he said no, he's not done with it yet. You'll have to go find something else to do. So in those moments, they are real learning opportunities, ways to work on very meaningful kind of communications for little ones that they're usually highly interested in learning because they see the benefit. It's great. If I can tell this little one, no, mine, and not have him take my toy, I want to learn those words. So it's a great way to work on communication as well. Okay, so let's move on and just talk really quickly about those little ones who are doing it for random reasons because they're seeking the sensory input. I've done other videos on the sensory system, which you can go check out. But when I'm talking sensory input, it's a need that the brain has. So again, we'll see these little ones doing a lot of putting things in their mouth or chewing on their shirts. When you see that, that should be your cue. They need oral motor input. So one strategy that many families that I work with will use will be a Chewy tube. And I'll put the link for a Chewy tube down below. It's just a really hard rubber chewy thing so that when you see your child maybe biting or putting things in their mouth, you can say, you can bite this. So we're not telling them you can't do this because it's a need, right? They're doing it because their brain is like, I need something in my mouth. We have to help them fulfill that need so the brain can be like, okay, I'm good. I don't need that anymore. So here's the hard part with using a Chewy tube is you need to keep that on your persons. It has to be with your little one all the time. What happens a lot of times is parents will get a Chewy tube, and then when their child bites or is mouthing things, they can't find the Chewy tube because the child has dropped it maybe in the toy box somewhere, never to be found again. So what you want to do is figure out how you can somehow keep it close to or attached to your child so that it's always accessible. So when the book goes in their mouth, you say, oh, you can chew on this. Or when they bite you, you can say, oh, you can bite this, so that they know that they can meet that need that way. So a really awesome parent that I worked with many years ago came up with a great idea, and she bought her little guy a hoodie. And she used one of those, I always say it wrong, carabiner clips. And she hooked his Chewy tube onto the zipper of his hoodie. And I said, well, what do you do when it gets warm out? And she's like, I just cut the sleeves off. So that was perfect because when it was zipped up, he always had his Chewy available to him. And usually what happens with kids is as you make that Chewy available and you continue to redirect them, with that input that they're using with that Chewy, eventually most kids outgrow the need for it and it just becomes a thing of the past. Some other strategies that you can try would be to give them chewier foods, which can be a challenge with toddlers because we always worry about choking. We don't want them chewing things like gum or really chewy candies like Milk Duds. But I've had some parents who have tried things like using untoasted bagels or having their little one do some real oral motor work by drinking applesauce out of a straw or using fruit smoothies. When they're using that straw, they're really working out those muscles in the mouth. So trying to find other ways to incorporate some oral motor input during meals and snacks. Okay, so that's it. Those are some tips and insights on why biting often happens with young children and some strategies that you can use to try to eventually diminish the behavior. Now, if you found this information helpful, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe. It helps me get my information out in front of other parents who are looking for support, and I certainly appreciate that. If you have any questions for me, you can click the button below if you have any ideas for content or subjects that you would like me to address. All right, you guys, until next time.